My second grade teacher wore black. She wore black all over, all the time. She wore a black dress that went from her neck to her ankle. She wore black shoes with black straps. She wore black cat's eye glasses that hung around her neck on a chain. And she had steel gray hair that was pulled back in a bun on the back of her head. And she carried not a broomstick, but an 18-inch wooden ruler. And she would stalk around the class looking for people who weren't doing what they were supposed to do, people who were violating the rules. And if she caught them, she'd whack them on the hand with that ruler. And I was the #1 sinner, because the #1 violation was daydreaming, and I couldn't help it. I daydreamed all the time. I was a born daydreamer, an inveterate daydreamer, a committed daydreamer. And so I'd get whacked every day. And some days I'd get whacked twice or 3 times. And one time I got whacked 4 times. I went home and I interrupted my dad, who was reading the Scientific American. You don't interrupt my dad when he's reading the Scientific American, but I did. And I said, "Oh, look at that, a blister on the inside." And she whack, 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 and it hurt. And my dad looked at it, and he looked up at me, and he said, "You probably deserved it." Well, I didn't think I was going to make it through the 2nd grade. I was sure that if I did make it through the 2nd grade, it would be as a kid with one hand. As a matter of fact, as soon as I realized that I might lose that hand, I began daydreaming about being Captain Hook. And I was doing okay, kind of. And then one day she announced that we were going to make volcanoes. And each kid was issued a cafeteria tray and an empty deviled hand can. And she brought in a huge tub of paper mache and put a bunch of pictures of volcanoes on the bulletin board. And, you know, we'd probably been studying volcanoes, but I didn't know. And each of us was supposed to sort of make a volcano on our tray and put that can, that empty devil's ham can, down in the top. And then we're supposed to paint the volcanoes after they dried to look like something on the bulletin board. And man, you should have seen my volcano. I put some serious energy into making it beautiful. I painted the lip of the crater red so it looked like it was glowing, and I painted black rivers of lava down the side, and I painted green jungle between the rivers of lava, and it was beautiful. It was a work of art. It was easily the best volcano I had ever seen in my whole life. Well, I got home one night and was telling the family at dinner about how I was going to be doing this volcano, and that the way we're going to do it is you get a thimble full of soda and you put it in the little can, and then you get a jigger full of vinegar and you pour it in there, and the volcano is going to erupt. And my dad said, "Huh, I have an idea." Well, the next day he came home from work and he had an oversized test tube of orange crystals. And after dinner he said, "Let's try something." We went out front, and on the sidewalk he poured a little pile of orange crystals, about a quarter-size pile of orange crystals on the sidewalk, got out his pipe lighter and tried to light it, but it wouldn't light. So lit a match and tried to light it, and that wouldn't light. So he said, "I've got an idea." And he went in the house and came back in a few minutes with a package of Black Cat firecrackers. And he unraveled one of the fuses and stuck it down in the orange crystals and lit it with his pipe lighter. And when the fuse burned down to the orange crystals, they burned. And orange and white sparks, silver sparks went everywhere, and this little pile of grayish green, blackish ash piled up. And Dad said, "That's going to be good." So he took a fuse from another Black Cat firecracker and slid it down in the test tube with the rest of the orange crystals and put the cork back in and handed it to me, gave me a book of matches and said, tomorrow, when your turn comes, don't you put that little thimble full of soda and that little jigger full of vinegar in the can. Just pour in these orange crystals, stick the fuse in, light it, and get back. I did. The next day, when it was all going on, the other kids would get up there and they'd put their thimble and their jigger, and their volcanoes would erupt. It was like, bleh. Foam would just sort of bleh out the sides of the volcano. It was just as exciting as nothing. But when my turn came, I poured in the orange crystals and I stuck the fuse in. And as soon as my second grade teacher saw me do that, she's charging the front of the room like this with her 18-inch wooden stick. Ah! And so I lit the fuse and I jumped back, and as soon as the beautiful orange and white sparks started shooting 2 and 3 feet in the air, and the big blobs of grayish, greenish, blackish ash started tumbling down the sides, she went, ah! And ran the other way. And she ran out of the room, and all the kids were terrified. All the kids in the room moved to the very back of the room and crowded against the windows as far from me and my volcano as they could get. And I stepped back from my volcano and went, ha. Well, after a few minutes, she came charging back in the room, and she had one of those old-fashioned canister fire extinguishers that's steel and brass, and when you turn it over, the soda and the acid mix. See, my volcano was going to get some of that anyway. And a stream of soda ash came firing out the nozzle, and she blasted my volcano into smithereens. I mean, there was blobs of wet paper mache and blobs of floating blackish greenish ash on the pool, and it was just, actually it was kind of cool. She just blew it up. And when it was all done, she sent all the other kids to the cafeteria to await further instruction, and she called the janitor to come and clean up the room, and she handed me an envelope addressed to my mother and said I was to leave and take it home. Well, my house was about a 15-minute walk from my grammar school, and it took me a little over 2.5 hours to do it. And when I got home, my mom was taking her afternoon nap, and you don't want to wake my mom up from her afternoon nap, so I just sort of slid on into my room and shut the door. And that night after dinner, I walked into where my dad was sitting with his Scientific American, and I said, Daddy, I got this note from my teacher, and I handed it to him. And he took out his penknife and opened it and looked at it, and he said, son, I'll be driving you to school tomorrow. And at that point, I knew I was dead. I knew that I had ended my life on earth. The next day, my dad and I drove to school, and we went to the principal's office. And it turns out that the principal had an inner office and an outer office. And in the outer office, there are these 4 or 5 chairs that are tiny. They're designed for little 2 second graders. I sat down in one of them, and my dad sat down in 3 of them, and we sat there and waited for the principal to call us. My dad wasn't much one for small talk, so he sat there and thought about whatever he was thinking about. After a few minutes, the principal opened the door and she said, Dr. Pearsall, you can come this way. Sam, you can go back to your classroom. So I went back to my classroom, and everything was perfectly normal. My second grade teacher had everything back the way it was, and she was stalking around the room with that 18-inch wooden ruler, and I took my place and tried hard all day long not to daydream. And that night, I asked my dad, I said, how'd it go? And he said, fine, and went back to his Scientific American. Well, I didn't know what was happening. The next day, Well, I didn't get any sleep that night, but the next day I went to school and walked to my class, and everything was normal again, except the 18-inch ruler was missing. It was gone. And my second grade teacher had a new punishment for daydreaming. If she caught somebody daydreaming, and it was always me, if she caught somebody daydreaming, they had to stand in the corner facing two blank walls, just like this, for an hour. It was perfect. I got caught daydreaming, and my sentence was an hour of daydreaming. I'd stand back there in that corner, and sometimes I was Tarzan swinging through the jungle on a vine. Ah! And sometimes I was Davy Crockett fighting Mike Flynn on a riverboat with quarterstaffs. Tack, 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 tack. Whew. Sometimes I was Zorro carving a Z in the fat backside of Sergeant Garcia. But most often, I was an intrepid explorer in a pith helmet, hacking my way through a lush tropical jungle, on my way to rescue a lush tropical maid from being sacrificed at a volcano that looked exactly like mine.